What are some of the things that have always bothered you or puzzled you? Anybody? Yeah.
I don't know, why do we put boundaries on love, friendship, and desire?
Oh, that's a good one. Boundaries, yeah. You can approach that in different ways. I mean, you can ask, what does it actually mean to put a boundary? And you can say, well, when should we do it, or when shouldn't we do it? Are there different cases? And already we're moving into different areas of philosophy when we're doing that. How do you know that you're making the right choices with the boundaries? That's part of epistemology. You might actually, for asking that question, you have to delve into human nature a bit, to get a good idea about that. That's a very concrete question. That's not like, what is being? That's very specific in its generality, we might say, if you want to be paradoxical. What are other things that puzzle you? I think relationships are something that do puzzle us quite a bit. What else? Yeah.
Does there always have to be some sort of common ground to build a friendship?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. We'll talk about that when we actually start digging into friendship. Again, that would fit into philosophy of human nature, into ethics to a certain degree. You might also ask questions like, do the friends have to know that they have a common ground? Or how do you know that you have a common ground with somebody else? What does it mean to have common ground? You've probably had some experiences in your life, I'm willing to bet, where you thought there was common ground, and it turned out that you were interested in the same basic thing, but they had a very different take on it than you did, and maybe the friendship ended at that point. What else? What are other things that have puzzled you, irritated you, or amazed you? Yeah.
What forms ethics?
Oh, okay, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can move on to things like, well, how should we actually live, treat each other, think about things. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there ever such a thing as a 100% selfless act?
Oh, that's good too. Certainly a lot of people talk like it, don't they? And yeah, now we're starting to get into something that they often call philosophical psychology, exploring what makes us tick. Did you have your hand up? Somebody did over there. Who else? There's quite a few of you in here, yeah.
What is free will? Do we actually have it?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Now that fits into metaphysics, and it also fits into what we call philosophy of action. And that's a big one to get out of the way, isn't it? I mean, if we don't have any free will, then there's a lot of other things that we probably don't need to think about. But if we do have free will, then there's a lot of other issues that flow from that. Like, when are we actually free? Or how responsible are we? What else? How about one more? I'll start going into the shtick about here's this, here's that. Any other big, yeah?
What is success?
That's a good one. Yeah. That would, interestingly enough, fit in with ethics, if you conceive of ethics broadly enough. I think that's something that's pretty important for you guys here as students, especially at the beginning of your career, to think about. What counts as success for you here? I mean, a lot of people want to measure it with grades, and you guys have, I'm guessing, most of you have gotten pretty good grades so far and been praised for that or rewarded for that, and you've got the idea that it's important to get good grades, and I'm not knocking good grades, by the way, but you're going to realize that grades don't really translate into success, and they don't translate into having learned or having lasting knowledge or developing talents. There's some connection, but there's a big disconnect between the two of them. So what's actually going to be success for you? You're a lot more likely to reach that form of success, whatever it happens to be, if you actually have some idea of it, rather than just sort of proceeding willy-nilly and hoping that things fall into place. This is kind of an aside. A couple generations ago, your grandparents' generation, they probably actually could, the people that are called the baby boomers, they could more or less blunder through things and things would turn out okay. College was cheap back then, work was plentiful, America was sort of riding high on a crest of prosperity, and it's been tougher for my generation, much tougher, and it's going to be much, much tougher for your generation. We're reverting back to where the rest of the world is, most of history, where it's not quite so easy. So figuring out what counts as success for you. Is it having the top job? Is it having a good family life? Is it meeting the person who you were destined to be with the rest of your life and falling in love and doing all those sorts of things? Those may not be all compatible with each other. And so you probably do want to think out those sorts of things. And we do that in philosophy in different areas. Now, I'm going to put a lot of words on the board, and we don't have enough room on the board to actually put some of the questions under them, so you're going to just have to remember these. And some of these will be words that are derived from Greek, because philosophy in the West begins in Greece. For instance, this word metaphysics. Metaphysics literally means that which comes after physics, in part because Aristotle's work that's entitled the Metaphysics came after his work that's entitled the Physics in his corpus. But now it's come to mean something a bit more specific, 2,000 years later, 2,300 years later. Here's another one that's coming from Greek. Epistemology. The word episteme means knowledge, or something that's a discipline. Like, are any of you going into psychology here? So that's an episteme, or if you're, yeah.
How do you spell it?
There you go. Anybody pre-med? Medicine would be a form of episteme, something that we have systematic knowledge about. It might also be what we call a techne, a craft, but that's a different matter. Here's another one that you probably didn't realize is coming from Greek. Ethics. Comes from ethos, character. Also, another closely related word that means habit, because for the ancient Greeks, a lot of what we do is a product of our habits. So we need to look closely at our habits and see what kind of people we make ourselves into, what kind of characters we develop. Here's another one also that comes from Greek. Logos is a word that can mean about 20 different things in Greek, ranging from word to account to fiction to story, but it can also mean reason, and it can mean argument. It can mean a constructed, set going from some beginning points, premises, all the way to a conclusion with some inferences along the way. And that's what logic tries to examine. Sort of the rules of good thinking, of proper inference, how we get from point A to point B. So these are some big areas, but they don't cover all the things that we're interested in. If we start looking at some of the big questions that they ask, there's some other questions about how we ought to live, or who ought to hold power, that we put under social and political philosophy. What is power? What is power over another person? Oftentimes ethics and social and political philosophy get lumped together in a big catch-all called value fields, right? Because they deal with human values. Good and bad, right and wrong, just and unjust, fair and unfair, legal and illegal. Are there any other things that we tend to have value judgments about that you can think of? There's good and bad and right and wrong, but that's not all that we are concerned with, is it? Let's think about music, for example. How many of you like music? How many of you have iPods or something that plays MP3s? Every one of you? How did you decide what goes in there? Did you evaluate everything on the basis of ethics? This song is very uplifting. It's going to make me a better person. I'll put that on there. This song, no, this would make me a bad person to listen to it. Is that how you evaluate what you listen to? Maybe a few. I don't know. Maybe some people do. But how do you evaluate it? What prompts you? Besides, well, there's a popular band, I should probably, give them a listen. How were your tastes formed? Your tastes as an individual.
What you do in life?
Okay, yeah. I mean, oftentimes we pick up the music that other people that we like listen to, right?
Sure.
That may actually be the basis for some friendships. It was for me in high school.
What you've grown up listening to?
Yeah, we absorb our background. Sometimes they're tied in with warm, fuzzy memories too. Dad used to listen to this song when we were washing the car, so good, nice associations. But after a while, you start to, especially when you become an adult, you start to make your own path when it comes to that. Music is one of the great consumer commodity items for us by which we choose our environment. We don't realize what a massive choice we have compared to people, generations ago who were stuck with whatever the musicians back there were going to play or whatever it was on the jukebox. You can walk around with literally thousands of songs and listen to anything you want at any given time. That opens up the whole field of what we call aesthetics. And aesthetics has to do with art, but I wanted to begin with an example that is much more down-home, easy to relate to than, like going to the art gallery and staring at a painting and saying, what does it mean? Is it moving me? Because we don't do that often, do we? I'm not knocking art, by the way. I'm just saying, in our culture, if you want to look at our ordinary experience, music is what we make aesthetic decisions about the most. This band sucks. Why? Well, they're just derivative of this other band. You've made another aesthetic judgment. You said that being derivative is not as valuable as being, creative, original, something like that. You have lapsed into the world of aesthetics, whether you realize it or not. What else should I put up here right now? Let me mention philosophy of human nature, which is what we call philosophical anthropology. Anthropos is human being. Ology, that means study of, right? So philosophical anthropology means to study the question, what does it mean to be a human being? What are the basic things that connect us all up together? It's nice to say human being is the rational animal, but what does that really mean when you unpack it? That's what philosophical anthropology would do. It would look at questions like, what is the will? Do we have free will as well? It would fit under philosophical anthropology as well as other places. So let's stick with these for just a moment and look at some of the big questions that they ask. Let's take logic. Logic asks things like, how should we argue? How should we put together the claims that we make along with the justifications for those claims and the modes of inference? How do we know that we're actually inferring things the right way? And there are rules for some of these things, and I give you some of that in iLearn. You can study logic as an independent discipline. There's a lot of stuff there, and it actually, at its basis, gets very close to mathematics, interestingly enough. When I was an undergraduate, I was particularly interested in logic and the foundations of mathematics, and I did a lot of work in that. And then I ended up leaving that behind, in part because I felt it was kind of sterile and I was more interested in these sorts of things. But there's a lot there. And we're not going to be exploring logic thematically in this class, but we will be using it. And I'll try to point that out to you over the course of the semester. Every time that we look at an argument, we're in a way doing some logic. We're saying, put aside what the argument's about. Is the argument the way it's set up a good argument or a bad argument? If you're asking that question, you're asking a question that's concerned with logic. There's other things that can get tied in with it depending on what your conception of logic is, but I don't want to get too deep into that. Let's move over here to metaphysics. Now, when I say metaphysics, what does that call to mind? Because we do have some cultural assumptions about that. So something's metaphysical. Was it just like a big keep away sign? Keep off. Oh, that's metaphysics. We don't want to that stuff. There are some people who claim to be doing metaphysics, or they say they're doing something metaphysical. I remember when I was in graduate school, one of the first classes I took was a metaphysics class, and the instructor, at the beginning of the class, the very first day, he was this British guy, and he said, now I want to make this really plain to all of you, that we're not going to be talking about crystals here, or wavelengths, or things of that sort of nature, psychic readings. Some people do call that metaphysics, but what we're doing here is philosophical metaphysics. We're looking at other sorts of things. So it's not these things, although they do have a basis, if you dig deep enough, those beliefs about those do have a basis in somebody's metaphysics. What metaphysics is examining is the nature of reality. So when you've gotten into debates about what's real and what's not real with somebody, you've been doing some metaphysics whether you realized it or not, whether you called it that or not, right? The difference between appearance and reality, that's a metaphysical question. What makes things, work the way that they actually work? That's a metaphysical question. How are things put together? Is there some sort of one primal substance that everything's made of, or maybe it's atoms, or nowadays, we break it down further and further in particles, and then, start coming out with quarks, and maybe 2 generations from now we'll have something lower level than that. Is that the basic building block of everything? Other questions too. What is time? That's a tricky question. One of the guys you're going to read this semester said, that's one of those questions where I think I have the answer down pat until you actually start asking me and putting me on the spot. And then suddenly I realize that all the explanations that I had just totally unravel, and I have no idea what I'm talking about. That was St. Augustine. In his book about time, where he says that. Because time is kind of a tricky thing. If you think about those movies that you see where there's time travel involved and paradoxes about what if I kill my grandfather, is that going to alter history, or will I cease to exist? That's a metaphysical question. Or think about another kind of movie. Could this all be the Matrix? That's in part an epistemological question, but that's also a metaphysical question. Because do you remember what the Matrix was made of? What was the basic substratum of it? Or is that movie getting to be a little bit too old for, yeah. Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. That's okay. How many of you have seen The Matrix? So not everybody. I guess we can't use that as sort of a common touch point anymore. Those of you who've seen it and remember it, and putting aside all the dodging bullets, kung fu stuff, what was the movie really about? Who remember those scary guys? The ones who could fight everybody, and Keanu Reeves finally kills one of them at the end of the first one. What were they? What were those guys? They're agents of God? Not God. Yeah.
Robots, sort of?
Yeah, they were robots, except they weren't corporeal, were they? Because where was all this taking place?
Virtual reality.
Yeah, exactly. In computer things. There were, all these people plugged in to this gigantic set of tubes and sloshing bathtubs, I guess, or set up as batteries, So there was that metaphysical thing, but the reality that they were experiencing was virtual reality. So if we ask questions like, is virtual reality also real? Or you could ask this about dreams too. If you die, people have the thing. Do you remember this in middle school? Hey, if you die in your dream, do you die in real life? There are movies that in the 1980s, they were really fascinated with this question. That's what Nightmare on Elm Street, all those movies were coming out. Well, those are metaphysical themes. I don't know if you ever thought about that, but you're dealing with metaphysical themes. Epistemology is kind of connected with metaphysics because it has to do with knowledge and with truth and with certainty. How can we be certain about things? What degree of certainty can we achieve? Those are epistemological questions. So are any of you, for example, going into, say, criminal justice? Okay. You will be dealing with epistemological questions all the time. Whether you're a cop, or a parole officer, or a counselor, or a guard, or an officer over these people, you're going to be dealing with this epistemological problem of how do you tell who's lying to you and who's telling the truth? That's a big issue, isn't it? Can you imagine trying to be a cop and having no sense about who's lying and who's not? How long would your career last? Unless somebody's like covering you, you're so-and-so's nephew. They give you all the easy cases. But those are epistemological problems. There's other epistemological problems, like the Matrix one. How do we know that we're actually not in a dream or in a virtual reality or something like that? That's an epistemological problem. What is the nature of knowledge? What goes on when we actually have knowledge? And what are maybe second best things to knowledge, like right opinion? Those are all epistemological questions. Do you see the connection and also the difference between these two? Is it starting to coalesce for you? Ethics. Now, when I say the word ethics, what comes to your mind?
Right and wrong.
Yeah, that's usually how we put it. Or rules.
Morals.
Morals, yeah. A lot of people want to say ethics is one thing, morals is another, and I don't do that because in the history of philosophy, that's not the case. It's an arbitrary distinction. People want to say sometimes, well, there's moral codes and there's ethics. A moral code is an ethics. A moral code is telling you how you ought to act. A lot of the professions that you guys are likely training for, criminal justice is one of them. There is, criminal justice ethics as a field. How many of you are planning on going into business or accounting? So there's business ethics. They're actually putting together a course on that, which you might be interested in taking if it's up and running by the time that you guys are doing it. Although I like having business majors in my class, they contribute a lot to it. Any of you going to be doing communication? There's communication ethics, journalism ethics, medical ethics, all sorts of things. Every profession has some sort of code out there, not that a lot of them necessarily live up to it, but they have some sort of code, some ideals about how you ought to behave. A former student of mine from Marist is right now engaged in a legal ethics class, and he was one of my ethics students, and so he was telling me about some of the stuff that they're studying, and he's finding it fascinating. And he's really finding it fascinating how hard it is to walk the line of doing everything that the code requires and being a good lawyer. Interesting ethical question. What else do you think ethics might include? So there's right and wrong rules, codes. There's other stuff that you get worried about that actually fits into ethics in the way that we do it in philosophy. Yeah.
Like how what you do will influence other people.
Effects and consequences. Yeah, that's important. What about the question of how should I run my life? What's a good life and what's a damaged or an imperfect or ruined life? Those are ethical questions. At least they were for the Greeks. Do I need friends or don't I need friends? That's an ethical question. That fits into this broad domain of ethics. I'm not going to go into too many of these because I want to get to some of these other things. We talked about aesthetics. Aesthetics asks questions like, what is beauty? What makes something art? I mean, can I just, we'll make some art right now. All right, we got a found object, and now I'm going to sign my name on it. There you go, work of art, right? Who wants to buy it? Anybody? You know, $50. Now you still want to buy it? Probably not, right? 50 cents. I don't think it's even worth that, but I'll sure for 50 cents. Now, if you got a reaction, you're like, that's BS. That's not art. You're making an aesthetic judgment, and there's reasons why this is not art. I don't believe this is art. You don't believe it's art either, right? Good. You were just doing that for the sheer entertainment value, right? And entertainment, by the way, fits under aesthetics. What's good entertainment? What's bad entertainment? These are all questions that have to do with a very important part of our lives that we often don't think of in terms of philosophy. What makes a person attractive? That's an aesthetics question. What makes a person ugly? Is it all physical? Or is there some component to the soul to it? Can a person have an ugly personality? That's an aesthetic question. It also ties in with ethics to some degree. Political and social philosophy you could think of as like ethics, but tying in with bigger questions like how should our society be organized? Who should run the show? Who should get to vote? Who shouldn't get to vote? John Stuart Mill, for example, who you're not going to read this semester, he actually thought we Americans were totally crazy. He was all for democracy, but we give everybody one vote. That's nuts. You should give everybody intelligence tests. And if somebody has like twice the intelligence of somebody else, they should get 2 votes. And if somebody's dumb, give them like a half a vote, right? That's an issue in social and political philosophy. I remember when I did a blog entry about that, and I wasn't saying that Mill was right. I was just mentioning that. People were incensed because they felt that's anti-democratic. That's a social and political philosophy question. What else? We talked about philosophy of human nature. There's a lot of philosophy of stuff. What are some topics that people get in debates about that maybe philosophy would have something to say about? Yeah?
Is it better to be feared or loved?
Oh, yeah. Well, let me put that one off till the stuff about love and friendship and desire. But let's think about it this way. So, what are the things you're not supposed to talk about at the dinner table, nice conversation? Politics is one of them, right? What else? Yeah.
Religion.
Yeah. Now there is what we call philosophy of, and I'm just going to put ... here so I don't have to write when I'm doing all these philosophies of. Religion. What do we do in that? We don't take a stance like, well, I'm raised in this tradition, so therefore I'm going to argue for that tradition. We explore questions like, well, what is religion? Can you actually define religion? What do the religions have in common? Is there a God? Is there gods? Can you make an argument one way or another? We deal with questions like, well, let's say there is a God, and he's actually, what people generally say he is, omniscient, omnipotent, and all good. Why'd that kid die in the street the other day? Why is there evil? Those are questions for the philosophy of religion. And philosophy of religion is tied in with metaphysics and with some of these other fields as well. Are there other things that you could get wax philosophical about? Yeah. Oh, you didn't have your hand. What are other big concerns for human beings? I'll give you a hint. Put aside the fact that we're doing philosophy here. What are we engaged in? Yeah.
Like about our economy and stuff like that.
Yeah. Oftentimes we call that political economy. So that could fit in there, but you could have philosophy of economics. I knew a guy who specialized in that. But what are we doing here? What's supposed to be happening here?
Like
Yeah.
education?
Education, yeah. So there is, in fact, a well-established field called the philosophy of education. Some philosophers that we're going to read this semester, like Plato and Aristotle, contributed massively to that. They're not quite so influential in contemporary education. That'd be more, say, like John Dewey who, by the way, did not invent the Dewey Decimal System. That's a different Dewey guy. But John Dewey influenced American education. There's a lot of different philosophical takes on what is actually going on when learning happens. How should you teach? What should the teacher be like? Now, some of that probably fits into ethics, and some of that probably fits into political philosophy as well. There's some overlap here. What about science? Do scientists actually fully understand what they're up to? Or do they sometimes get so narrowed in on their little portion of what they're studying that they lose sight of the big picture? It does happen sometimes. Not only with the natural sciences, but also with the social sciences. You know, for example, where did are any of you doing sociology? Studying sociology or psychology? Where did these disciplines come from originally? Anyone know? Before Freud came on the scene. He was a psychoanalyst too, not just a psychologist. They came out of philosophy. Philosophy is the mother of many disciplines. Comte, one of the fathers of sociology, he was a philosopher. And so, you know, why is that the case? Well, because a lot of the big questions that you're approaching, like what is science? What is scientific method? These are things that philosophers think about. A lot of scientists do as well. Or, you know, questions like, you know, what about science and religion? Are they totally incompatible? A lot of scientists and a lot of religious people don't think very deeply about these sort of things. Knee-jerk reactions. Philosophers will often think quite a bit about them. You may not have thought of this one. There's philosophy of language. What is language? How does it work? Could music, for example, be a language? Those are questions in the philosophy of language. What is a definition? That's a question in the philosophy of language. Going to the question of free will, that ties in with a broader field, which is really kind of a mix of philosophy of human nature and metaphysics, that we call the philosophy of action. What motivates us human beings? In a lot of ways, this is connected together with psychology, isn't it? But this could be a great application for people in business, for people in criminal justice, really any place where you got to figure out what makes people tick and what, you know, channels their capacities. To what degree are they able to make choices or not make choices? How do human actions actually happen? That's part of the philosophy of action. Now, we could write a lot of other things up here. We could write philosophy of technology. We could write philosophy of mathematics. Really, any field that you go into, you're going to find that as you move up in the field, you're asking more and more philosophical questions, more and more questions that are broad in scope, that often tie in existentially, as we say, with who we are as human beings, the things that we're really, you know, concerned with, the things that our situations impose upon us, and things that people, they're questions on which there are many different answers, in part because it's not as if everybody agrees about them. And you could even ask the question, why doesn't everybody agree? That might be a philosophical question that you want to explore as time goes on. Some people probably have a better idea about some of these things. You know, if in metaphysics you think that we're all made out of celery sticks, you're free to have that opinion, but you're probably in a philosophical school of one, all by yourself on that one, right? If you think everything's made out of atoms, that's a starting point that a lot of people would go with. If you think that people have a soul or don't have a soul, there's arguments one way or another on that. Those are philosophically reputable positions. Again, if you think souls are made out of celery sticks, I've never heard of anybody ever saying something like that, and it seems kind of silly to begin with. You're probably not going to make it too far doing this sort of thing. Now, as you go on with your career, you're going to run into philosophical questions. And what I've done here is give you some of the terminology to be able to recognize that when it happens.